Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Vaš. I'm the founder and president of GLOBSEC, one of the three institutions who are co-organizing this webinar. So GLOBSEC, Institute, Montaigne, and Bruegel. And let me welcome all of you who joined today at this webinar, at Zoom, but also on who are watching us live on social media. Let me welcome Kristalina Georgieva, our dear friend, the managing director of International Monetary Fund, our today's star, who will be speaking about the role of the IMF in the post-COVID-19 fiscal recovery and stabilization. Not an easy task these days, not definitely, but I'm very glad that the managing director is a Centre European, a proud Centre European. She's also a laureate of the GLOBSEC European Award. She has been attending GLOBSEC forums and Tatra Summit before. And actually, I think it was at GLOBSEC, Kristalina, remind me if I'm wrong, when you received just a call to become the CEO of World Bank at that time. So the time flies, the time really flies. So let me also welcome here Chairman of Institute Montaigne, Henri de Castries, and Guntram Wolff, Director of Bruegel, who will be the first respondents, and Vazil Hudak, who is the co-chair of GLOBSEC, who will moderate this session. Well, this world is definitely at a very unique moment in its history. We are facing a very serious challenge of the global pandemic, but by far this is not only a health problem. This is a multidimensional crisis that is touching our basics of our economies, societies, of how we cooperate, our multilateral institutions. And we know that this is a transformational crisis that will stay with us for a long time, and its consequences will be feeling for years to come. Also, this crisis has accelerated several major trends internationally that we will have to be able to manage. One thing is clear, we still don't know all the consequences of COVID-19, but we know that we can only succeed if we work together as an international community. And we can only succeed if we will be trying to find European and global solutions for this problem. Dear Kristalina, welcome again. I would like to pass the floor first to Vazil, who will moderate it, and I'm looking forward for the discussion.
Thank you, Robert, and good afternoon to all those who are joining us from Europe. Good morning to those who are joining us from the East Coast of the United States and any other time zones around the world. We are very happy to have this discussion, and again, a huge appreciation to Kristalina Georgieva for joining us. Before we go to substance, I just want to mention a few logistical aspects I was asked by the organizers to mention. As you know, the session will last for 1 hour. The session can be also promoted through Twitter on hashtag @ResilientEconomies. Those who will be asking or want to ask questions, please do so through the Q&A part of the monitor. Those who will be then selected for the questions, you will be also on the screen. So don't worry, you will be seen and you will be heard. We have several representatives of media with us as well, so we hope that media will be active in the discussion. And what I will do is I will try to group the questions of around 3 altogether, so that then Madam Managing Director can respond to a group of questions. So that much about the logistics. Now about the substance. Dear Kristalina, we are so happy to have such a capable person at the lead of the IMF, especially in this very challenging situation, as Robert already mentioned. I remember from our joint experience when in 2016, in the fall, when you became commissioner for budget in the European Commission, and I was government plenipotentiary during the Slovak presidency of the EU, and we were working on the budget for 2017. And I remember it was not an easy exercise, but very, very interesting. And we did it eventually. It was a long night session, as I remember, which is usual for Brussels and for European politics, but we made it. So I believe we will make it also with challenges related to COVID-19. I think one issue which I would like to pose on the table, and then I will go to Henri and to Guntram. I think one of the issues is, and when looking at IMF as the guardian of fiscal stability in the world, that today we are in the situation where there are many different types of responses to the economic slowdown globally, especially through providing liquidity lines at the national level, to governments, to enterprises, of course, as a result, increasing public and private debts. So my question would be, how is IMF going to react to this? How do you see the issue of fiscal stability long term? How do you think we should deal with the issue of growing debt globally? And how do you see the position of IMF in this new environment? So that much from my side. Henri, if we could move to you, and any questions from your side?
Sure, thank you, Vazil. Kristalina, it's great to see you again. I have two quick questions for you. During this crisis, the rivalry between the US and China has even increased. How can the IMF constructively navigate this tension and make it a sort of constructive cooperation rather than sterile antagonism? Second question, where do you see your priorities in terms of economies and sectors? And how do you react to the, quote, greenization of the restructuring or restarting efforts? To what extent should we greenize everything, which is great, but could have the risk of putting in or leaving in bad shape some sectors who are providing immediate jobs and immediate production and wealth?
Thank you. Thank you, Henri. Guntram, please, any questions from your side?
Yeah, I mean, I very much look forward to hearing from you, Managing Director, and of course also to ask questions afterwards. But I mean, at this stage, I think one of the most interesting questions, it seems to me, is really about the emerging market economies and the mother of all liquidity and the mother of all crisis that we might be actually seeing in the emerging economies. We see huge outflow of capital, we see a huge outflow of funding. And I think there is a really big question about the liquidity provisioning to these economies. But there's also a big question about debt relief. And the more you can say about debt relief, the Paris Club negotiations that are ongoing, the fact that perhaps not everybody is on the same boat. Perhaps China is not as willing to join in debt relief as the other countries. I think the more that would be very, very interesting for us to hear from you.
Thank you, Guntram. So we apologize, Kristalina, for such a fast movement towards the opening salvo, but please, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much from the bottom of my heart for an opportunity to reconnect with GLOBSEC and to have this very impressive trio of institutions sponsoring this webinar. I have very warm memories from coming to GLOBSEC meetings. I have the award I got from you in a prominent place in my office. And as much as I'm attached to the efficiency of webinars, I do much prefer to have a chance to see you not too far in the future in person. You put a very impressive set of questions to me. So let me go straight to what this crisis is, how we position the IMF in responding to it, and in terms of the questions you posed, where do we see the world going and where we see our role in it? So you have heard me possibly saying that many times, a crisis like no other. And it is indeed the first time since the Great Depression when we have seen such an abrupt change in fortunes. And on top of it, it applies to the whole world. No crisis since the Second World War would be truly global as this one is. We have today 170 economies, all European countries included, that are going to end 2020 with lower per capita income than they started the year. And just to remind you, it was only in January when we projected that 160 countries will finish with positive per capita income growth. That reversal of fortunes is a shock that fortunately has been also matched by the magnitude of response. And it is very important to recognize that when we got into a sudden stop of our economies, governments and central banks acted decisively and acted very rapidly. And I would take credit also for the IMF, so did we as well. So what we are seeing is a massive increase of liquidity provided by major central banks, and actually by any bank, central bank that can do it, combined with also further monetary easing, conventional and non-conventional policies in full speed. And then we also see massive fiscal measures totaling some $10 trillion. Just as a reminder, during the global financial crisis, we were talking about a trillion to put the floor under the world economy. It grew to be more, but what is being done today is really, truly remarkable. And let me give some kudos to Europe for stepping up individual countries' action, but also a collective action. I'm very hopeful for the recovery fund that got this very good name, New Generation EU, to come into place. Vazil, remembering the long nights on budget negotiations, I have no doubt there will be long nights of negotiations on this fund. But it is a symbolically important as it is important financially, because among other things, it is a chance to restart the convergent engine of Europe that has been stalling for some time. So when we look at the phases we are going through, we had the great lockdown. Now we have gradual reopening, very careful with some reversals. And now is the time to also think about the future. What would the recovery look like? So let me say a couple of words about the fund and then zero on your questions. At the fund, we acted swiftly from the moment we saw this crisis coming. What we have done is to put a massive injection of emergency financing. Never in our history we have done so much in such a short period of time. We have nearly 70 emergency financing packages disbursing. We have disbursed $25 billion in less than 7 weeks time. And we also are providing to our membership precautionary financing. We did precautionary lending to Peru and Chile, renewed for Colombia. We are also stepping up with speed our engagement through normal programs. For example, we just did virtually last week a program for Ukraine. So in financial terms, we are there. Very important to stress for the countries that need us the most. And it is those countries where the capacity to do more is quite limited. So taking on a very important role for the fund, which in the minds of people takes us a backseat vis-a-vis financing, but it is actually as important, if not even more important. It is the surveillance function we do. What does it mean? It means that we take the pulse of each and every economy, and we take the pulse of the world economy as a global public good. So we very quickly did two things, very new for us. One, we merged epidemiological projections with our traditional macroeconomic modeling. So we can project the likely developments of this crisis. We did our global and country by country projections in April. We said we expect shrinking of 3% for the world. We are coming with the next projections in June, and unfortunately it is going to say, well, it's actually worse than that. For majority of countries, we will be revising projections downwards. For a small number of countries, we will be revising them upwards. And the second thing we did on this hugely important function of taking the pulse, the vital signs of the world economy is we created a new global and country by country surveillance on measures countries take to respond to this crisis. So for 193 countries, you can immediately find out what they have done, how does that compare to their peers, and this is a transmission line of learning that we have heard time and again is very valuable. Now we are enhancing it to also tap into what measures countries are taking to reopen safely and effectively. And obviously, we are looking into the future. We are looking into the recovery. In terms of fiscal stability, well, you don't hear the head of the IMF to say that very often, Vazil, but I have been saying now for the last months to the membership, please spend as much as you can, but keep the receipts and keep in mind that that cannot be carried out without growth forever. When we look at the fiscal stability parameters today, there are pieces of good news we have to recognize. One, we learned the lesson from the global financial crisis. Year on our year, the banking sector is much more sound today than it was in 2007. And that is helping with trust in what the financial institutions are doing, but more importantly, with their capacity to function. And also we have this unique environment of low to negative interest rates that allows governments, and for that matter, the corporate sector, businesses, households, to retain through borrowing stability. We are not seeing what we were very worried about. I'll tell you, this is where I lost sleep. Are we going to see a wave of bankruptcies and then unemployment related to it with a huge scarring to the economy? We can say we have put a floor under the world economy successfully. And the other very important signal we got in this crisis is that countries that have worked on sound fundamentals are in a much better position in the midst of this crisis. When central banks poured a lot of liquidity, that was very important for their own economies, but it also has a huge positive spillover impact for emerging markets. And going straight to this question on emerging markets, what we saw in March was, scary. All of a sudden in March, markets closed down, and we saw $100 billion flying to safety out of emerging markets, developing economies, to the advanced economies. In April and May, the huge provision of liquidity for countries with good fundamentals meant they can tap into this liquidity. And we have seen massive increase of emerging markets debt issuance, going to the bond markets by now over some $83 billion. This is way more, 3.5 times to 4 times more than what these countries issued in the same 2 months, April and May last year. However, for those who do not have sound fundamentals, or where debt levels are very high, or that are fragile because of conflicts of natural disasters, this is definitely not the case. They have no access. On the contrary, they have a problem of staying current on their debt payments. And this is where actions on debt are so critical. We, together with David Malpass, the president of the World Bank, we called for a debt standstill for the poor countries. The G20 embraced that. Today, we have 73 countries eligible, and about half of them applying for this debt standstill, for this debt moratorium. China actually announced that it is making for 77 countries this provision of debt standstill available. And to answer your question on China, we need to remember that China is a relatively new lender, and there are many organizations and ministries in China that play a role. So within China, there is now a recognition that there has to be consolidation on debt provision. And this is where the difficulties mostly lie, in the fact that there is no one China when it comes down to lending. There are multiple institutions there. And since I'm on the topic of China, let me go to the broader issue of tensions around in international cooperation and the issue of trade. So we, just before the pandemic, the biggest worry we had in terms of prospects for growth were actually related to protectionism and trade tensions. Now, the pandemic is adding to these concerns. Why? Because it is natural for us, when we stay behind the walls of our homes and we try to stay behind our borders to protect ourselves, that there would be also this temptation to do whatever we can for ourselves, not thinking of the rest of the world. The EU has been really smart in that regard, calling for global action on vaccines and against protectionist measures. So thank you for that. And we have to recognize that in the next months, the next years, one of the big tasks we will have as a global community is to improve the way trade functions. In other words, fix the problems we had before the pandemic. A big problem we had was that e-commerce and services are not part of trade agreements. We know very well that technological transfer is not something that we are all happy about. So way beyond individual countries, we have a very important role to revitalize trade, revitalize the globalization that has served us so well for so many decades. And if we fail, let me just spell it as it is. We fail to do so, costs would go up, incomes would go down, and we would see more poverty around the world. So I would, at the IMF, we concentrate on objectively defining shortcomings of trade and globalization. We have to deal with them, but also be clear about the benefits and creating the economic argument for as to why we should overcome divisions in the future. And as we do so, I would say that sustainability is going to be a big issue. Trade and global value chains is going to be a big issue. Poverty and inequality, a very big issue. And therefore, we have to think today of a recovery that can help us to go on the other side of this crisis with more resilient economies, economies that are greener, and economies that are smart and fair. Now, what does it mean? I mean, it means that we will have three big instruments in our hands. How we use them would make a difference of the world of tomorrow. One, fiscal stimulus. Are we using it to create green jobs, to make sure that digitalization not only moves, it is moving, this is the big winner of this crisis, but it is equitable? And are we making sure that the incentives we put in place would create a more resilient, more shock resistance economy? The second thing we would have in our hands is tax policies. I mean, let's face it. On the other side, more debt, higher deficits. We will have to think about reshaping taxation. How we do it, whether we decide to, for example, put a price on carbon more decisively everywhere will matter. How we tax digital will matter tremendously for whether we can sort out inequalities. And the third big instrument we will have in our hands is the ability to provide incentives for structural adjustments that do not build excessive inequality in the future. We have to think of digital is great, but not necessarily a huge, massive job creator. So where are the jobs of tomorrow? How we make sure that we have a world where that is growing, but it is also growing in a way that is job rich. And I think policymakers today have even bigger responsibility than they had before the pandemic to address these huge challenges and also embrace them as an opportunity for a greener, smarter, fairer world.
Thank you very much, Kristalina. I think this was very clear and very well articulated what the role, I would say the new role of IMF should be, because as you mentioned, this is a new unique situation with the global crisis, first of this type. But I would avoid going too much into my own comments. Instead, I would like to ask our first two discussants, Guntram and Henri, whether you have any comments before I go to the others. Guntram, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kristalina. It was really great, and a lot of points I fully agree and share. Look, I want to just push you on 2 points, really. I mean, the first point is the point you made at the very end, which is about debt and taxation. And whether or not we need to increase taxes and at what stage we need to increase and how to do that. Now, here there's really two views in the economics profession. One view is, well, we'll have to do it pretty quickly because basically if we don't do it, the revenues aren't there and sustainability is endangered. and perhaps inflation will go up very quickly. And so we are basically in a world where very quickly we have to tighten both monetary and fiscal policy to manage this debt overhang. And then there's this other view, and I personally belong more to that second view, which basically says, well, look, I mean, interest rates are very, very low. I mean, we've now had, just after the announcement of the German package, recovery package, we had the first time for a long time that German interest rates at a 30-year horizon actually became positive again, right? I mean, first time. So basically debt is for free at the moment, right? I mean, we don't have to pay an interest on that in the advanced economies. And inflation is very low. I mean, if anything, the pandemic has had deflationary effects, not inflationary effects. So is the recommendation, is it really time now to already start talking about sort of future interest, future tax increases and all of this? I personally have my doubt, and I think we are in a world where demand is going to be more depressed than supply for quite some time. And we should acknowledge that the demand support is probably necessary for some time. So that's my first. My second is related, but it's also your point on trade, which is your trade policy point. I mean, and I think that's where I would like to push you a bit more, because of course, if we don't get trade back, we actually have a problem in terms of productivity. We have a problem in terms of actually, perhaps even in terms of inflation. We might actually get inflation if we don't get trade up again. But at the same time, we have some players, and you are located in one country, which is a player in that sort, which actually think, well, look, I mean, this whole business of trade, we exaggerated globalization. We should go back. And I guess my question is, how do you really want to deal with this trade issue? And how do you really want to convince the many, many skeptical players, countries, but also parts of civil society that, trade in the end, if it's managed well, is actually beneficial if it's managed well? Thank you.
Yeah. Do you want me to come now, or we listen to?
Maybe Henri, if he could, if you have any questions, and I would like to ask everybody to keep remarks very brief, because we have many others who are waiting for answering asking questions. Please.
Thank you, Vazil. I'll be very brief. Thank you, Kristalina, for having answered the questions I raised. On taxes, I'm very much in Guntram's camp. Don't you think that the approach should be nuanced? Because there are countries, and I know pretty well one, where the issue is not the level of taxes, it's more the lack of structural reforms and the excess of public spending.
Tough question. Kristalina, please, if you could answer this.
So I'm actually on this question of tax, since Henri brought it up. Let me start from the second question first. I am, and it actually connects to that issue. I very much agree that we should be very careful not to withdraw support too quickly. Remember, we did it after the global financial crisis, and that had unintended negative consequences for quite some time. However, we have to think ahead and recognize that any evolution in tax policies takes time. It requires building up consensus. So we cannot really say, well, for the next couple of years, just forget it. We don't touch it, because if we are serious about modernizing tax policies, and mind you, it doesn't necessarily mean a major increase overall in taxation. But we do have two problems, and these problems are getting more severe by the pandemic. The first one is the problem of growing inequalities. Practically across the board in OECD member states, what we have seen since the global financial crisis is not pretty. In many countries, with very few exceptions, inequalities have increased. And most dramatically, they have turned into primarily inequality of opportunities. Let me give you one example, very dear to my heart, and it is education. quality of what we get for our future. Europe has only 2 countries now that are in the top 10 of PISA. Only 2, the rest is Asia and Canada. Today, in the European Union, 20% of our 15-year-olds are basically illiterate and innumerical, 20%. If they are from a poor family, this percentage jumps up. Even in the best of countries, it goes up to 35, 40%. In my country, 40% of 15 years old are innumerical and illiterate. How on earth we intend to compete in the knowledge economy unless we concentrate on what is actually dragging us back? And obviously that would be a major focus post-pandemic if we want to succeed. The same applies to R&D. We know the accordion of R&D investments is open up very widely. You have Finland up there, and you have, I'm not gonna name my country again, not to offend it, but you have countries that are way under, still under 1% of GDP. And then we have the issue of going green. We have countries where they have adopted carbon taxes. Sweden has done it maybe most effectively than anybody else. Why is it that we are slow on recognizing that a shift in taxation would be a competitive boost for Europe? So we have this, we have inequality and we have structural change we want to underpin. And the other thing we have is the big winner of this crisis, digital. Are we comfortable to retain digital to be not contributing to the rest of society through taxation? So I think we have to, again, I want to repeat myself. I am not advocating for rapid shifts, but I am advocating of thinking about ways in which we can have a better distribution and a better quality public expenditures. They go hand in hand. Going to the issue of debt, I could not agree more. I mean, when interest rates mean that you are being given money, why would you not use this period of time to protect the economy, protect against bankruptcies, protect against unemployment, make sure that there is an investment program for the economy of the future to generate growth? So I'm totally with you on that. I don't advocate at all for moving rapidly to austerity. And let me remind you, that is our message: spend. But when you say spend, of course, it doesn't mean that this should be willy-nilly, you throw money around. It has to be strategically aligned with your priorities and objectives. And we have to recognize that while interest rates are very low to negative today, for this soundness of our financial system, for the soundness of our banks, for the soundness of how a market economy functions, money cannot be free forever. This is not going to be a good economic place for us. So that gradual shift, the thinking about where we are headed, has to start now. And that gradual shift obviously would take quite some time. I also agree on inflation. We don't see it in major economies. We don't see the risk. Even what we are more worried is actually deflation. Still, despite of the amount of money that is thrown at the economy, we see the risk of inflation in some emerging markets. So we have to be careful not to say, oh, it's universal everywhere. And we will have to still watch it, because if we don't get the economy to perform, high quality growth to return, then there is danger of too much money floating around without a good purpose.
Thank you very much, Kristalina. I think your message, spent but in a strategic way, is very clear and makes a lot of sense. I hope the governments...
Vazil, I want to repeat that.
Yes.
Keep the receipts, accountability for the money spent.
That's correct. Spend in a strategic way and keep receipts. It's very clear. If you don't mind, Kristalina, I would go to the other people who are on the line and who already asked questions. I would like to start with the State Secretary from the Hungarian Ministry of Finance, Gabor Gion, who also happens to be my good friend. Gabor, are you with us? Can you ask the question?
I'm with you. I'm not sure if you can hear me and see.
Yes, definitely.
Yes, we can. Very well.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, it was very interesting to listen to you, Kristalina. I think what we spend time with here at our ministry is really thinking about future and trying to predict how the world will look like in the future. Because I mean, we have a pretty good consensus that return to normality will be on the table when a vaccine is developed. Until then, it will be kind of back and forth. But what would the normal be, the new normal? That's a big question. I mean, whether the level of globalization would change, the globalization that we were used to 6 months ago. So I have a pretty strong feeling that the normality will mean something different than what we had 6 months ago. What we are trying to figure out what this new normality would be. So I would be pretty much interested to actually hear your thoughts on that, Kristalina. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great to hear you, Gabor, and thank you for the question. So, what would be in this new normal? Well, there are things we know and there are things we don't know. What we do know in this new normal, as you called it, is that it will be a faster penetration of digital. As I said, this is the big winner of this crisis. The experts say we probably have seen 2-year acceleration as a result of where we are. So we would have everything that is related to digital picking up speed. We also know that there will be a debt overhang. We talked about that. So we will have to gradually think about how we manage this in the future. We don't quite know to what extent the green economy is going to pick up. For the reason Henri brought up, there are countries where concerns for jobs may lead to protecting industries that are not necessarily fitting in a low carbon climate resilient economy. I do hope that we would put some speed into dealing with this problem for a very simple reason. If we don't like pandemic, we sure are not gonna like the climate crisis. It is, we know what the risks are and the actions that we can take to reduce these risks. And Henri, I didn't quite answer your question, but unless we zero on job-rich aspects of low carbon climate resilience, we are going to be in a bad place. And what are the job-rich aspects? Of course, building insulation, reforestation, land management, sustainable agriculture, mangroves, and coastal zone restoration. These are areas that can be contributing to a job-rich future. But again, it's not going to fall from the sky. There has to be policy work done in this direction. And then what we don't know, Gabor, is how deep the scarring in terms of both trade and travel will be. I tend to be an optimist. I believe that vaccine is going to be available probably early next year. I have faith in our scientists, but this virus, this tiny little thing, is so yet unknown that it is hard to predict whether even with the vaccine, we will see a revival of travel the way we used to know it. And therefore, how tourism, how the global interactions would be affected is early to say. For example, we just now got some research talking about possible impact of this virus on brain cells. Well, so you may be immunized and protected, but if it is not completely so, if you are still exposed, what would be the impact? We have to recognize this unknown. Now, some are already projecting a future in which virtual visits to all global museums will become an enjoyable entertainment. Well, let's see whether this would really happen. Would tourism be more in localities rather than flying? What would that mean for aviation and the travel industry? Hard to predict. So my advice to everybody is, yes, there is a lot of unknown, but there are things we know, and there are policies we know would work for our competitive advantage. And let me just say, we also know that solidarity, working together, has proven over many centuries to be a way of boosting the quality of life and opportunities everywhere. So I take it we have to protect that. And by the way, the EU, huge role to play. This is the moment in history for European leadership on all these issues. I hope Europe would embrace it big time.
We hope so too. Kristalina, we have quite many questions, and because we don't have too much time left, 12, 13 minutes, so if you don't mind,
I will shorten my answers.
And I would like to ask those who will be asking questions to be very brief. I would like to actually go for a kind of pandemic of questions, so five questions, starting with Paolo Magri, then Ryan Heath, Alain Leroy, Jorge, and Eric Cheney. So could we start with Paolo?
Thank you. Managing Director, thank you very much. I'm quite sure the first part of your message, spend, will be heard and followed. I got more doubts on the second part of your message, keep the receipt, at a time of urgent, rapid action, emergency action needed. When your message was save and cut to countries, you had empower enforcement measure to do that. How can the IMF help or make sure countries keep the receipt when in time like this?
Thank you. So I understand Ryan is actually not available anymore. So Alain Leroy, please.
Yes, good afternoon. Just like to know, we know that many African countries are requesting a new issuance of SDRs, and we know that the US are against. Is there any chance that the US will lift their veto on the issuance of new SDR? And if not, is there any obstacles for the lending of existing SDRs, which can be very helpful for developing countries?
Thank you, Alain. Jorge? If not, Eric Cheney.
Yes, thank you for giving me the mic, and thank you very much, Mrs. Georgieva. That was fascinating, and I love your call on education. I'm an economist. I'm advising Institut Montaigne on economic matters. And my question is on carbon pricing, because you have mentioned that, and I thought that was very interesting. We economists agree that carbon pricing is probably the best tool to go toward decarbonization of our economies, but we don't know how to do that. It's very hard to build a consensus among countries, even when they are supposed to share a single market. So do you have any kind of a piece of advice for the European Union, I'm not talking about the world, to move toward a consistent pricing policy with, of course, a border adjustment? Otherwise, there would be a carbon leakage.
Thank you all, Kristalina. I know quite a broad range of questions, but if you could somehow summarize.
Let me try to be succinct. On the first question on keeping the receipts, already in our emergency financing, we are encouraging countries, although we are not imposing conditionalities, we are encouraging countries to apply auditing of what they have spent the money in this time. And we are going to be massively supporting countries to be able to follow the money, trace how money was used, how effectively was used in response to the pandemic. And so we are very much encouraging countries to move rapidly on e-government. We know that if we have e-government and public expenditures, both revenues, raising revenues and public expenditures can be traced, it is a very powerful way to get the citizens in monitoring the behavior of the authorities. And we are making this priority in our capacity development as well as in our program development for the future. On the question of SDRs, indeed, at the moment, we don't have the required 85% support for a new SDR allocation. There is a reason for that. When we do a new SDR allocation, it goes pro rata of the countries, if you wish, shareholding in the fund. In other words, depending on quotas, countries would get allocation, additional new allocation. Well, since 62% of the owners at the fund are advanced economies who do not need an injection of SDRs. For some, this is a questionable contribution of liquidity to those who don't have it and badly need it. Now, since you asked the question, is there a chance for this to happen? I mean, all options are on the table. Let's see how this crisis evolves, the longevity and the depth of the crisis. This is not something that we have completely, we are ignoring. At this moment of time, the pressure is eased because of the massive liquidity that allows emerging markets with good fundamentals to issue bonds at fairly low cost. But as your question indicates quite rightly, there are countries that do not have that luxury of access to markets, and they do need an injection that can be done by tapping into existing SDRs. So to answer the second part of your question, we are working on it. I'm actually positive we have a lot of support for taking SDRs for countries that do not need it because they have their own currencies, convertible currencies, and then shifting to countries that need it. And just to give you an indication that how big a difference this would make, if we were to issue 500 billion SDRs, the poor countries would get 3% of it, 3% only. So if we move existing SDRs equal to 3% or more, we are actually doing the right thing for the countries that most need it. And finally, on carbon pricing, the IMF has done quite a lot of research on that, and the conclusion is straightforward. The most efficient way to apply carbon price is through carbon tax. carbon tax is used in a number of countries already, and where it is used properly by taking some of the receipts to compensate people that may be affected on the lower income range of the spectrum, then there is a public acceptance of this tax. Now we are at the point when oil prices are low. There is a chance in countries willing to do so to both eliminate harmful energy subsidies if they have them, but also to think of moving in the direction of raising more revenues in a fair and equitable manner by properly distributing these revenues by introducing a carbon tax. Politically not easy. I recognize that. This is why we talk still about carbon price, not just carbon tax. But if you take the most efficient way to create an incentive to move to low carbon, this is a carbon taxation. I can give you an example like Ireland. You can start with relatively low tax and then have your objective to bring this tax to the level where it will help you to shift your economy. So by 2050, you get to net zero. Now, the European Union made this commitment to net zero by 2050, and it would be useful at this point of time to think about incentives for in all countries, preferably in a synchronized manner to do so. I mean, any way we look at this problem, it is not going away. The science on climate change is very, very clear. And unfortunately, the world is still a bit behind. The average price of carbon globally is $2. The price of carbon we need if we are to go to net zero is $75. So a long way to go. We better start going.
Good point. Maybe last questions. Jorge, are you on? Can you go with your question?
Yes. Thank you so much for your remarks, Ms. Georgieva. I am worried about emerging countries, and my question goes basically there. Many will face a painful adjustment in the aftermath of COVID to bring back debt to a sustainable place. Several countries will struggle with borrowing needs at low rates, and some will face troubles covering external liquidity needs. So lots of financing needs to go there. So my question is the following. It is clear that the IMF is the most appropriate institution to deal with these issues. But I wonder if you can go a little bit into detail about the decision-making process inside the IMF in this regard. I am not concerned about the macro soundness of the analysis. The IMF will do it as usual in a very sound way, the debt sustainability analysis, the macro analysis, the structural reforms. I am a bit concerned about how quickly the process can take place, although it is true that all that you have done rolling out new facilities and approving the facility credit lines, as you said, on Peru and Chile has been quick. So my concern is the following. Going forward, we need to generate the incentives for those countries to reach out to the IMF, right? So they need to know that while the process of negotiating will be tough, while you're going to probably tell them to do things that is going to be very good long-term and probably generate some pain, they also need to know that it is worth the effort of getting there in terms of getting the money that they need. So they will go there, and that will have a huge positive externality for global growth as long as the amount that they see at the end is worth their while. So my question would be, how do you see this process going?
Excellent question. Thank you very much for it. We look with the same sense of concern at the emerging markets, even those with strong fundamentals like advanced economies, face a degree of uncertainty, and they are building up for that uncertainty, in some cases, more debt and higher deficits, as they should, to put a floor under their economies. But then comes what next? And for the fund, we look at it, if you wish, in a triage. The first group of countries are countries with really strong fundamentals. They have built buffers, they have built fiscal discipline. And to these countries, we say, if you want to get an additional insurance, relatively low cost insurance from the fund, please take it. There are no conditionalities on our precautionary lending, the flexible credit line you pointed out too. And actually, right now, Latin America seems to be the region ahead of everybody else. We have 4 flexible credit lines in Latin America. They got the name platinum countries because they're so good. So one of our board members recently joked that we should rename Latin America in the fund to Platin America because of that use of flexible arrangements. And I would say to countries around the world, do not hesitate. It is all about confidence building. If you have strong fundamentals and you feel you might want to have an additional buffer, don't shy away from the fund. The second group of countries are those that are the traditional program countries, if you wish, to the fund. They cannot get, they cannot borrow without any conditionality. And sometimes you rightly say that kind of makes countries to wait. And my message to this group of countries is that we fully recognize coronavirus, the pandemic, is an exogenous shock. We want to work with you on building your competitiveness and your strength. And our teams are fully aware of the, if you wish, extra problems on the shoulders of these countries. We are obviously very keen to be supportive in a longer term. What I'm telling you, that we don't want rapid pool of support. That applies also to the way we think of our programs. Take a longer period of time to get to a point of fiscal sustainability. And then the third group of countries are the countries with high debt or high fragility, or both. And for these countries, what we are doing right now is to rapidly look into, can we assess on a country-by-country basis what is the debt sustainability path that the country can take. And again, we are very conscious that in the debt universe today, there isn't an easy institutional platform for debt resolution aside of the Paris Club for the countries that are mostly indebted to the Paris Club. And therefore, what we want to see, Jorge, is to work on building more alliances around how we go about cooperation on debt sustainability in the future. How we work with the non-Paris Club members. Can we have a forum in which, as it was done now for the debt standstill, in which there is a broader engagement? And very important, how we engage with the private sector. At this point of time, it is primarily on a country-by-country basis. What the fund is doing, I can tell you, it's a topic for us, is to have a more granulated understanding, anticipate where the issues may be, and be there on the side of sustainability. We are not going to get out of this crisis one country at a time. We will have to build a platform that is a global platform. Finally, fortunately, our membership was smart after the global financial crisis to quadruple our lending capacity. Back then, we only had 250 billion total. Today, we have 1 trillion, and just slightly over 250 billion is already committed. So we have space should it be necessary. Of course, we are a lender of last resort. We always prefer that countries use their own buffers and capacities and access to markets, but we are there for our membership. And I can tell you, it is the moment for which the IMF has been created. We are fully cognizant of it.
Thank you, Kristalina. I'm aware of the fact that we are a little beyond the original scope for this discussion. I know we have been going through different topics because IMF is a global institution and we are facing a global issue, global problem, which has many different elements. I would say for me, the key issues were one, that, as you said, spend, but keep receipts. And I think this is very important. I think also, as you pointed out, that those countries which have strong fundamentals, even in the period of crisis, they can survive and have ability to access international markets and keep in relatively good shape. That we should use recovery as an opportunity to build more resilient economies, to focus on green and innovative, smart approaches to economic development, but also to avoid any new inequalities and try to smooth those which do exist. And of course, it's very good to know that there is enough firepower at the IMF. And although it is a lender of last resort, and hopefully will not get to this last resort, but that there is this institution, global institution, which can help countries and institutions in problem. Thank you so much for this. Of course, the last word will go to you. I just want to mention that we do hope at GLOBSEC and in Central Europe to see you in the beginning of October, when we will have a forum in Bratislava. Hope to see you back. And as you mentioned, there is nothing better than having direct interaction with people. And Slovakia is a safe place. So we hope also for those who are here with us during this webinar to join us during October 7 to 9 in Bratislava. But please, Kristalina, you have the last word.
Just to thank you very much for giving me this platform. We are at a point in our history when the choice is between reversal and renewal. And I certainly hope we will make the right choice. And especially for the European Union, it is a chance to build up your unity of purpose and spread it to the rest of the world. Thank you very, very much for this platform.
Thank you very much. And also big appreciation to our partners, to Bruegel Institute and Institute Montaigne. Thank you and have a good day, Kristalina, and to everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Kristalina.